Psychic is a broad term that covers a number of extrasensory perceptive abilities such as telepathy and clairvoyance. It basically means anybody who has the ability to gain knowledge outside of the five normal senses: sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch.
But in the modern world of science and technology, what evidence is there both for and against such abilities? Is it for real, or is it just self-delusion and con artists? That's what we set out to uncover in this episode of
Is That For Real?
Perfect.
Through the ages, psychics have played an important role in society. What they were called really depended on whether or not they were in favor at the time. In the Bible, they're called prophets if they're good, or witches if they're bad, with one exception: the witch of Endor, whom Saul, the king of Israel, went to see and was able to summon the spirit of the dead high priest Samuel.
In ancient Greece, people believed to have ESP ability were called oracles and were seen as an important part of decision-making to the Greek rulers. The name psychic that we use today actually comes from a Greek word, psyche, which literally means breath, but can also mean soul or mind or self. And the term psychic was coined by a French astronomer and started gaining use in English in the 1870s. So, there's a little background for you. But what about you, Deasis? Are psychics for real, or do you think it's all just hocus pocus? Do you think it's pseudoscience? What are your thoughts?
You know, as somewhat of a skeptic and an agnostic, I'm kind of caught in the middle here. I think some of it's real.
Yeah.
I feel like there's too many coincidences, for it to be completely invalid, honestly.
And let's just get this out there, since this is our first episode, that Deasis is much more of the believer and I'm much more of the skeptic, though I don't think either of us are just completely on one side or the other. If where there's evidence, I'm willing to bend toward belief, because where there's smoke, there's fire. And where there's not evidence, though, I just don't put any stock into it. But then some things
that depends on what you call evidence.
Yeah, and that gets fuzzy too. Like, you have some very interesting, and I will admit, I will say, they're very interesting stories of things that happened to you personally, or people you know personally, that related events that happened to them. And we'll talk about some of those in this episode. And so for you, that qualifies as evidence. Whereas to someone who's very hardline skeptic, they would say it's only evidence if it can be repeated under laboratory conditions and testing. But we're also going to talk about why that can sometimes be fuzzy and not always
tested.
Yeah, so we'll discuss that. But before we get into the first line of evidence, because we have a series of different lines of evidence, and then we'll cover all the things the skeptics say against the evidence. And then you can choose. We're not going to tell you what to believe. You choose what to believe. Whether there's enough evidence, where there's smoke, there's fire, you decide. While we do this, we're going to be using terms like psychic, psi, parapsychology, parapsychological phenomena. All that's interchangeable. But mostly we're going to just say psi, just because it's easier and saves the breath. And we're going to use psi phenomena as it is defined by Mario P. Varvoglis, the president of the International Metaphysical Institute of Paris: unexplained interactions between living organisms and their environment. So, with all that said, let's get into the first discussion point, which isn't evidence, but it's why people believe and what people believe. So let's give you a few statistics about that, and we'll talk about them.
Studies demonstrate that a majority of Americans do believe in the paranormal. including psychic ability. A Gallup poll from 2005 shows that 3 in 4 Americans profess at least one paranormal belief, with 41% believing in ESP or psychic ability. The poll shows no statistically significant differences among people by age, gender, education, race, and region. Christians are a little more likely to hold some paranormal beliefs than non-Christians, 75% versus 66%, respectively. But both groups show a sizable majority with such beliefs.
A second poll of 439 college students conducted in 2006 by researchers from Oklahoma City University and the University of Central Oklahoma suggested that college seniors and graduate students were more likely to believe in psychic phenomena than college freshmen. 23% of college freshmen expressed belief in the paranormal, while 31% of seniors did and 34% of graduate students did. However, the poll did demonstrate less belief in psychic phenomena among science students than social science and education students. Well, that was fascinating and definitely not something I expected when I started researching for this episode.
Indeed.
3 out of 4 Americans have some form of parapsychological belief. They believe in the paranormal. 75, 76%? What do you think about that?
I mean, I think it's really interesting. You think about, just society. And, you see educated people and secular people that are atheist. And then you also, see these same people that believe this stuff. It doesn't matter about your background or your education. Even here, it says cognitive ability. So that is pretty interesting that it's pretty much consistent across the board.
Yeah, that really surprised me, especially that poll, the one they took in Oklahoma, where the higher amount of education, the more educated a person was, the more likely they were to believe in something paranormal. Now, it wasn't the majority. It was 23% of college freshmen, 31% of seniors, 34% of graduate students. But the fact that it went up at all with education is just really interesting.
I think, what I think is interesting? Okay, here's what I feel, and this is my personal opinion here. Here's what I feel like smart, open-minded people do, especially those that come from a religious background where they definitely believed in a deity or a higher power, supernatural forces, i.e. whatever. It seems like you see a trend with a lot of people, not everyone, everybody's different, but you go from believer to total skeptic, and then through data research, recounting your experiences, being open to new experiences, it seems like a lot of open-minded people seem to continuously and across the board land somewhere in the middle.
Somewhere in the middle.
You see a pattern there.
That's certainly true of Americans.
Yeah.
3 out of 4 believe.
Yeah.
Now, see, and what's funny about that is the Gallup poll that came from had 10 different kinds of paranormal beliefs. Some people believed in some of them, but not others. So it's not like if someone believed, they just believed everything.
Yeah.
There were certain categories of things that they felt were legit and other categories of things that they felt weren't.
See, that's me.
Yeah.
And I feel like that. I mean, I feel like I kind of fall somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
So,
the way I word it for myself is how do I put it? I don't think it's all just completely bogus. What I like to tell people is I have never experienced such a thing, nor have I ever seen data that suggests that such a thing can be proven to be real. But I don't like to discount individuals' experiences because I also know that I do not know everything. I am not an expert in these fields. I don't have degrees in parapsychology or anything like that to be able to just across the board dismiss other people's beliefs.
See,
I don't do that.
That's what I like about you. You meet a lot of people like you who have not witnessed any kind of supernatural and, who are real secular minded, just realistic, facts, numbers based. And they are real quick to just dismiss people. Oh, yeah, well, that's because you're stupid, or that's because you were high, at the time, or you had to have been high. Oh, you don't smoke? Well, you were still high. You must have, they're so quick to write stuff off.
You got some bad mushrooms or something. Yeah, right. Yeah.
I like that about you. At least you're like, well, you know what? Maybe it did happen. Who am I to say that it didn't?
Yeah, that's how I feel about it. I don't like to judge people's personal experience, but I will say I do not believe, because I have never experienced it, nor have I seen enough data for me to believe that it has some proof.
But who's to say it hasn't, right?
That's true. And there are some things that we're going to go through that are really interesting.
Yeah.
Just wait till we get to the Titanic. That's fascinating.
That's right. Make a believer out of you, John.
Maybe. We'll see as this show goes on. Probably not, but I'm open-minded. Now, something that wasn't in the segment
John.
with all the statistics was Maria Brankovic. I'm not exactly sure how to say that. She is from the Department of Psychology in Serbia University of Belgrade. She did a study that concluded, and I believe it was a meta-analysis. Not only did she repeat all the things we already showed, that it didn't matter what your socioeconomic background is, doesn't matter what your education level is. She has a theory that it's all about cognitive style.
Right.
That people who rely more on intuition tend to be believers more of the time. That's where her study came out. Versus people who tend to default to critical reasoning and needing data or facts or numbers to prove things, they tend to shy away from those belief systems. So she says it doesn't matter how educated you are, how much money you have, how affluent you are, or even where you grew up.
Right.
What matters is, how does your brain work?
Yeah. Well, Carl Jung talked about the functions a lot, the cognitive functions. And we're actually going to be doing an episode at some point where we're going to be talking a lot about sociology.
Oh, yeah.
Which is something I've always been really interested in.
That's a fascinating subject.
It really is. For instance, Myers-Briggs, which, some people love it, some people hate it, but it's interesting, nonetheless, where, it talks about certain personality types. And within these certain personality types, some are more prone to the imagination and the speculative. Nothing wrong with that. It all has its place and it's all in, due balance. And then some are more on the skeptical side. Some are more of, well, show me proof or I'll believe it when I see it. And, they're not quick to get excited or, speculate or fantasize about what could be.
Sure.
So
whether the sociological pigeonholes that they put people in are a fact or not, or a real thing, which we will discuss, I, for one, am grateful that we have a spectrum of personality types, because we need
definitely
the engineers.
It's a rainbow, literally.
Really, we need the engineers who design the high-rises, who design the road systems, who design the financial markets things so that they work the way that they work, that they're logical,
the designers
functional.
who create the way that they look.
Yes, the artists. Where would we be without artists and musicians and the people who make all that stuff bearable? Because trust me, you don't want the software developer designing what your flower garden looks like. It would be the most boring.
This is inefficient. Eliminate it.
Yeah, exactly. You don't want that. You want someone who's creative.
Delete.
Yeah. So it makes sense to me that the way people think would influence whether or not they believe.
Actually, and this is actually getting back to the topic at hand here. So another thing I wanted to point out that I thought was really interesting is, about the why and what people do believe is that, when they go to college, it says that they believe more than they did when they first started, according to this one particular study. Mm-hmm. And a lot of secular-minded people will say, oh, well, that can't be true because people are typically less religious when they get out of college. But from what I've seen, and this is just what I've seen, I'm not any kind of a scientist at all, but I've seen that people get away from traditional religions, through college, like Christianity, Islam, and stuff like that, but not necessarily away from spirituality and believing in psychic ability or the paranormal and stuff like that. Parapsychology.
Well, the numbers do indicate that even though it's still the minority, there's a significant chunk of people who do have some sort.
Because, I mean, you see people become more secular-minded away from traditional religion, but they didn't necessarily break away from believing in parapsychology. Like, there's a difference.
I'm like you. I don't have any traditional religion, but I'm not 100% opposed to spirituality. Like, I practice mindfulness meditation, even though it's a secular practice, it's not a religious practice. It's a very spiritual experience for me, and I'm not opposed to that, even though I'm a skeptical person by nature. So
it's hard to deny that you don't reach some kind of a special internal connection with it.
It certainly brings me a lot of peace in life. Yeah. All right. Now, let's get into the evidence. Now that we have kind of a handle on why people believe, how many people believe, or more correctly, why, what does not prevent people from believing, like education or socioeconomic status. Let's look at the evidence that tends to come up, particularly from parapsychologists, to prove that psychic ability or psi is a real thing, starting with the placebo effect.
A placebo is anything that seems to be a real medical treatment, but isn't. It could be a pill, a shot, or some other type of fake treatment. What all placebos have in common is that they do not contain an active substance meant to affect health. Research on the placebo effect has focused on the relationship of mind and body. One of the most common theories is that the placebo effect is due to a person's expectations. If a person expects a pill to do something, then it's possible that the body's own chemistry can cause effects similar to what a medication might have caused.
For instance, in one study, people were given a placebo and told it was a stimulant. After taking the pill, their pulse rate sped up, their blood pressure increased, and the reaction speeds improved. When people were given the same pill and told it was to help them get to sleep, they experienced the opposite effects. Experts also say that there is a relationship between how strongly a person expects to have results and whether or not results occur. The stronger the feeling, the more likely it is that a person will experience positive effects. The fact that the placebo effect is tied to expectations doesn't make it imaginary or fake. Some studies show that there are actual physical changes that occur with the placebo effect. For instance, some studies have documented an increase in the body's production of endorphins, one of the body's natural pain relievers.
So for all of you skeptical, secular-minded people out there, all right, who don't believe in this, 3 words: the placebo effect. Bam!
It is crazy how someone can take a pill.
Yes.
That it's just a sugar pill or something, and the disease
over buildings.
Yeah, the disease gets cured.
Yeah.
Or their symptoms actually go down. I mean, it's mind over matter for real. Yeah. Because if it wasn't real, pharmaceutical companies, they wouldn't spend the money to do this kind of testing. No. They have to spend the money on it. They have to have the placebo.
They don't invest in anything that they don't have to.
Ain't that the truth?
Ever.
Yeah. And that part about from WebMD was just really interesting to me. Like the people took the placebo.
Yeah.
Were told it was a stimulant. Their heart rate goes up. Their blood pressure
20
increases.
years younger, right. Hair turned brown again.
But then they're given the same placebo and told that it's a downer, like it's supposed to help them sleep. And they experience the opposite effects. So if the mind doesn't have a powerful impact on the physical world,
something going on there.
How is the placebo effect a thing? It's really interesting to me.
Magic.
I got to say, to me, that is probably the strongest evidence for the brain's ability to impact the physical world. So although it's a long way, here comes my skepticism, it's a long way from being able to read somebody's mind from another room or something like that. It definitely does show that there is a mind over matter connection
Yeah.
that you can't deny. I mean, there's no scientist that's going to tell you the placebo effect isn't a real thing. They have
That's right.
They have to include this in pharmacological studies. They have to.
I think one of my favorite examples of the placebo effect is obviously Space Jam.
Right.
Space Jam.
Right.
Now, okay, maybe I'm showing my age here a little bit, but Space Jam, you know, when they're in the locker and, you know, Michael Jordan's like, oh man, you know, come on, guys, you know, we got to make this happen. I haven't seen the movie in years, so forgive me if I'm a little bit rusty here, but, you know, yeah. So Bugs walks up, I think.
Yeah, it was Bugs.
Yeah, it's Bugs.
Yeah.
Okay. He's got the bottle, and it's supposed to be the juice or the stuff, and it's water.
Yeah.
And they drink it, and then sure enough, I mean, they're like, yeah, you know, let's do it, and they win.
Yep.
And it's the placebo effect.
Yeah.
They felt that this was actually doing something, and so their mind or body or whatever it is reacted accordingly.
Are you saying that their blood pressure increased, their pulse rate sped up, and their reaction speeds improved
Absolutely.
based on this
Their
placebo?
skill level improved.
I know. It's just crazy. And it makes me wonder, like, how does that work? Like, if a person's belief, and this is where it gets important, if the person's belief in the placebo actually has an effect, because it does have an effect. It said in that same WebMD article that the stronger the person's belief is that it's going to work, the more likely it was that the placebo would actually work. If there's nothing to it, your belief shouldn't matter. Like, I can believe this table is going to launch into space all I want, but that's not actually going to raise it up off the floor even a little bit. But in this case, their belief in a sugar pill or whatever the placebo is, this inert pill that shouldn't affect them at all, actually mattered to whether or not they
It's those positive vibes, John.
So I get it.
From the universe.
Yeah, I get it. It's not enough for me to be a believer, but I got to say that is definitely a kind of a situation there.
There it is.
Yeah. But
I believe I'm going to have $1 million. Here we go. Damn.
If only that would work. But there's a lot of other things, and we'll also, of course, get into the skeptic side against all these arguments we talk about. The next one, what is it, Diasis?
The evidence.
Yeah, but what's the next line of evidence? Remember the experiment name?
The Gansfield.
The Gansfield experiment. Because you're kind of iffy on this one, but let's go ahead and play the segment that talks about what it is and how it works, and then we'll discuss it.
The Gansfield experiment is a technique used in parapsychology, which is used to test individuals for extrasensory perception. The Gansfield experiments are among the most recent in parapsychology for testing telepathy. In a typical Gansfield experiment, a receiver is placed in a room relaxing in a comfortable chair with half ping pong balls over the eyes, having a red light shown on them. The receiver also wears a set of headphones through which white or pink noise, static, is played. The receiver is in this state of mild sensory deprivation for half an hour. During this time, a sender observes a randomly chosen target and tries to mentally send this information to the receiver. The receiver speaks out loud during the 30 minutes, describing what he or she can see. This is recorded by the experimenter, who is blind to the target, either by recording onto tape or by taking notes, and is used to help the receiver during the judging procedure. In the judging procedure, the receiver is taken out of the Gansfield state and given a set of possible targets from which they select one which most resemble the images they witnessed. Most commonly, there are 3 decoys along with the target, giving an expected 25% by chance over several dozens of trials.
This one kind of looked like something out of some sort of freaky low-budget film. you know?
It looked like some Mystery Science Theater 3000 shit.
It really did.
Seriously.
So you've got someone sitting in a chair and there's a red light on them. Their eyes are covered with ping pong balls. I mean, if that is not low budget galore.
It looked like Star Trek from the 60s.
And wearing headphones, basically in a state of sensory deprivation for half an hour. There's a sender in another room trying to get them, like telepathically send them an image, which is one of 4 images for half an hour. And then at the end of the half an hour, the person who's sitting in the chair with the ping pong balls and all that has to pick out of 4 images which image was being sent to them. Now, it sounds hokey and ridiculous, but parapsychologists claim that they get a statistically significant hit rate above random chance when they do this. Now, the way math works, random chance, 4 items. If you just randomly pick one, you're going to be right 25% of the time across the board. And now you might be right more than that for a few times, but eventually if you keep picking randomly, you're going to hit 25% because it's random. You got a 1 in 4 chance, that's 25%. Parapsychologists say that they get a 32% hit rate. Now, while that may not sound like a lot,
it's a little.
7%
Enough to make it interesting, enough to raise an eyebrow.
7% above random chance across a long series of trials cannot be accidental.
Yeah. I think it is interesting. I mean, see, I'm somewhat of a skeptic even of that. I mean, you know, how do we know they're not kind of, pick one of these, right here.
Yeah, we will get into what the skeptics say about this because there are skeptics. But this is one, like you were doing a search on YouTube. And what were you seeing for this?
I mean, there's 2 sides here. Obviously. Like I said, I'm somewhat skeptic. I wonder what kind of subliminal images are they seeing on the walls or being told to them before they participate in the experiment? You know, what kind of indicators might they both participants may be subtly getting that might make them intuitively, subliminally be in cahoots with each other.
I got you. So like if,
you know what I mean?
if the person doing the sending
yes.
and the person sitting in the chair walk down the same hallway
exactly.
into the test and they see the same images, it may cause that 7% bump because they're not being properly
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
separated or segregated out.
Basically.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I get that. Now, parapsychologists have an interesting theory about why a lot of this stuff is almost never able to be repeated in independent studies by skeptics. So we'll get into a little bit about what you're talking about whenever we get to that.
They're not manifesting positive vibes, man.
Right. But in the meantime, what do you think about the Ganzfeld experiment? Let us know in the comments. And now we're going to play one. This is probably my favorite. Next to the Titanic. The Titanic's great. Wait till we get to that. About Daryl Bem.
Yeah.
Professor Daryl Bem and Feeling the Future. You guys get a load of this. Professor Daryl Bem's Feeling the Future experiment in paper. Bem is a social psychologist and professor at Cornell University and has a PhD in social psychology from the University of Michigan. He taught at Carnegie Mellon University, Stanford, Harvard, and Cornell University. His paper, Feeling the Future, was peer-reviewed and published in an elite journal, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. The study involved 9 different experiments conducted on more than 1,000 subjects. All of the experiments revealed slight yet statistically significant psi anomalies. For instance, Professor Bem showed students a long list of words and asked them to remember as many as possible. Then the students are told to type a selection of words which had been randomly selected from the same list. The students were significantly better at recalling words that they would later type. The instructions for a second experiment read like this. This is an experiment that tests for ESP. It takes about 20 minutes and is run completely by computer. First, you will answer a couple of brief questions. Then, on each trial of the experiment, pictures of two curtains will appear on the screen side by side. One of them has a picture behind it. The other has a blank wall behind it. Your task is to click on the curtain that you feel has the picture behind it. The curtain will then open, permitting you to see if you selected the correct curtain. There will be 36 trials in all. Several of the pictures contain explicit erotic images, couples engaged in non-violent but explicit consensual sexual acts. If you object to seeing such images, you should not participate in this experiment. The location of the image was selected at random by the computer, which means that students should have correctly guessed the location of the pornography 50% of the time. However, it turned out that over 100 sessions, the subjects consistently performed above chance and correctly located the porn 53.1% of the time. Interestingly, their hit rate on non-erotic pictures did not deviate from chance. They found neutral pictures, for instance, 49.8% of the time.
All right, hold on a minute. Where the hell is this study at? I mean, I'm down. I will totally do this.
Yeah, when I read about this, I'm like, this is totally Diaz's kind of study. Yeah. Yeah, just you're getting paid to pick
seriously,
porn. I mean, come on.
To watch porn.
What dude isn't going to sign up for that?
Look at porn.
But all that, funny business aside, it is really interesting that, again, going back to random chance, if you've got two pictures, right? You've got two pictures, and you're randomly choosing which image or, behind which curtain there's a picture, you should always get 50%. After a lot of guesses, it should always average out to 50%. But in this study, Professor Bim did, for the porn pictures, they were able to pick it out 53.1% of the time, which doesn't sound like a lot over 50%. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it's statistically significant. And the pictures that were not the porn pictures were chosen almost exactly 50% of the time. Right. So why should it be different just because it's an erotic image? What do you think about that?
There's a few things that ran through my mind, when looking at this segment. Okay. And this is actually growing in America. This is something that's been big for thousands and thousands of years. So it's by no means new, but in America, a lot of Eastern beliefs and spirituality, chakras, stuff like that. And I'm not a professional, so if I'm getting any of this wrong, forgive me, you crystal lovers. People equate sex to spirituality. And a lot of people think that sex is a gateway to spirituality and deep connection to the universe and all this good stuff. And then people, especially a lot of people who are into like the crystals, maybe zodiac tarot cards and star charts and stuff like this, talk about the pineal gland.
Oh, yeah. You were telling me about that, the pineal gland.
Yeah. And I mean, like I said, I know a little about it, so if I get any of it wrong, forgive me. You guys are more than welcome to comment and, let us know if you want us to do a little more research. Maybe we could do an episode about that at some point. But a lot of my friends who are, into a lot of the Eastern beliefs and, meditation, mindfulness, spirituality, crystals, magic, stuff like that, really believe that when you have sex, you're connecting with a higher energy or aspects of the universe that open up your mind in ways that you would not have or be under normal circumstances, which could be why, they're getting them right more of the time.
That little bump, 53%.
Yeah, and maybe this test is exposing the possibility of this integral connection between sex or sexuality and humans. Or they could just be really excited to try to find the correct image, because this is an exciting study.
It is interesting, though, that, I mean, just to put it in layman's terms, your level of horniness determines how good you are.
That is a motivator.
At picking the pictures. I mean, just, wow, that's really fascinating. And the pineal gland, after you told me about that when we were researching this, I looked that up, and it's very interesting because the pineal gland is right between the left and right hemispheres of the brain, and it is directly tied to human sexuality. And in fact, before it had the scientific name pineal gland, because it's shaped like a pine cone, thus pine-eel, it was called the third eye.
Right.
It was known as the third eye, the third eye, the spiritual eye, all that. So it is very interesting that human sexuality ties into spirituality in so many ancient religions and belief systems, though not in the like Judeo-Christian system where it's more frowned upon, but in much older, more ancient beliefs. And to be fair, the beliefs that in the past were the dominant beliefs of the world.
True.
And it was like directly tied. Yeah, and it does. It's definitely growing in popularity in the West.
Well, and one thing I want to point out too about what he said and about these tests, and this could have something to do with it too. Maybe them discovering the images at a higher percentage than the 50-50 should be. They're consensual, non-violent.
Right.
So it's the type of sex that would involve lovemaking, not any kind of, unwholesome or gruesome thing.
Yeah, this isn't something you would be averse to. You wouldn't look at that and be like, it's something that would attract you.
Exactly. Yeah.
I got you.
And that could be opening them up to something higher.
And as a skeptic, I would ask, but we'll get into the counter arguments. But I understand as a skeptic and as a numbers guy that how turned on you are should not affect the roll of the die at all. It should always be 50-50. And if it's not, something else has to be accounted for. Yeah. So it's very interesting. Yeah. And that of the two studies that BIM did that came up, that one was the most interesting. But the first one was really interesting too, where he shows the students a long list of words. He asks them to remember as many as possible. And then they're shown a random selection of words after that and asked to type them. And the students were significantly better at recalling the words that they would later be asked to type. So it's like they knew in advance the words that they were going to be asked to type, or at least that's what the parapsychologist and Professor Bim would say the conclusion is, that it shows, even if it's just small, it's a small percentage, it's statistically significant enough, and you're going to hear that phrase a lot because in these kinds of tests, statistics are everything. Skeptics have something to say about that too. But it is very interesting that they could recall the words better that they would later be asked to type. Just like it's interesting that people could pick the porn picture out from behind the curtain more often than pictures that weren't of any real sexual interest. Right. Unless you're some kind of freak. But those landed at 49.8%, so somebody was like 0.2% freaky, I guess. So it's off slightly.
Some freaks out there.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Some true freaks.
Yeah. Now the next one, the Titanic.
Yeah.
Precognition. Yeah. Let's roll the very fascinating information about that, and then we'll discuss it.
According to BusinessInsider.com, 2 books were written in advance of the sinking of the Titanic that share uncanny details with the actual event. One was written in 1886 and the other in 1898. The Titanic sank in 1912. The second is the most interesting. The Wreck of the Titan, or Futility. The story follows the fictional ocean liner Titan, which ultimately hits an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sinks. Like the Titanic, the Titan was described as the largest ship afloat at the time. In fact, the sizes and lengths of the ship are quite close, as well as the speed at which they crash into the iceberg. Both liners have a dangerous shortage of lifeboats. In the story, the Titan was both dubbed unsinkable and proceeded to sink on a cold April night.
Another book, Raise the Titanic, was written by Clive Cussler in 1976. It was a popular adventure novel at the time. Although the massive ship, which was almost 900 feet long and constructed of steel, would presumably have been easy to find if one were in the correct location and using the latest high-tech equipment, Cussler chose to have his fictional scientists stumble upon one of the vessel's much smaller cast-off boilers first. Sure enough, the actual ship Titanic was discovered 9 years later when one of the small boilers was indeed found, leading to the discovery of the entire ship.
Chief Officer Henry Tingle Wilde wrote in a letter to his sister from the ship, "I still don't like this ship. I have a queer feeling about it." Chief Wilde did not survive the sinking.
There are records of other premonitions, such as one passenger feeling uneasy and having his lawyer write up his last will and testament. He too went down with the ship. According to noted Titanic historian and author John P. Eaton, at least 50 would-be passengers or crew members canceled at the last minute.
Ahoy, matey! That was really interesting.
Yeah,
And
fascinating.
Yeah, see, that's what I'm talking about, John. Too much coincidence to just throw out.
Right.
Okay? Just too much. Just the 2%, which I know you know a little bit more about. The whole thing about it being discovered 9 years later.
Yeah.
Okay, now I don't know, again, here I go again with my amazing credentials, okay? Isn't 9 a significant number in numerology, which we got to talk more about that too at some point, but I could be wrong here, but in numerology, the number 9 is significant. And I forget why it's significant, actually, but I think it's new beginnings or endings or something like that. I don't know, but
That would be really interesting if it signifies new beginnings.
I could have swore. I don't remember. God, I don't want to.
That's right. Someone will tell us.
Yeah.
Someone will tell us.
Help us out, man.
Yeah. It is really fascinating. Like The Wreck of the Titan, that book, with all those details written decades
All
before.
of those details.
Well, 14 years before. A lot of details, down to it being a cold April night in the North Atlantic.
Telling you, John, something's up, man.
Yeah,
There's something out there.
It is really interesting, but like you said, the part that I found the most fascinating is that 2% of the passengers canceled at the last minute because the Titanic held, I believe it was 2,435, somewhere in there, passengers. 50% of 50 people canceled last minute. That's 2%.
That's it. There it is.
And when we were discussing
what more do you need?
well, the reason why 2% is important, see, we know because we talked about this, but they don't know yet. 2% is the percentage of people that are believed to show some statistically significant psi ability. There was a big meta-analysis of premonition done, and Mario Varvoglis, he's Greek, so that's the name. He talked about this meta-analysis in a YouTube video that showed 2% of the general population had some statistically significant psi capability. And this was studying all of the studies done over 50 years on precognition.
Did not get on the Titanic?
2% of people canceled for the Titanic.
There's something
really
out there,
interesting.
and they're watching us.
Yeah, now I'm much more skeptical about the people who were on the ship that got the jitters about it. Because, well, you're on a ship in the middle of the ocean. I mean, I could see why that would kind of spook a certain percentage of the population,
maybe.
With the exception of Chief Officer Henry Tingle Wilde, the guy who wrote to his sister. And he said, I still don't like the ship. I have a queer feeling about it.
Yeah.
Because he was a naval officer.
Yeah.
He's not going to be afraid to get on the boat. He's not going to have some jitters about it just because it's a big ship in the middle of the ocean. I mean, you don't become the chief officer if you freak out when you get on board.
I mean, that's kind of a good point. If you think about it, this was supposed to be the most advanced ship in the world, advanced cruise liner. If anything, you'd think, he'd be confident. He'd be like, yeah, let's do this.
Yeah, that's true. I mean,
we'll
it's
sail
like
to the moon and back. We'll sail right through the land, John. Ahoy, steam ahead.
I mean, nobody gets in a new car with all the latest technology and all the latest safety features and all that and gets the jitters when the car they used to ride in was a 67 Chevy Jalopy with no safety features. That was basically a tin can that would kill you the second you ran in. And you just die and it cuts you in half because the dashboard is sharp and all that. You don't freak out when you suddenly have the best of the best.
Yeah.
But he freaked out.
Yeah.
It's very fascinating stuff.
And the ship had no reason to sink. It's not like there were design flaws, at the time, or major design flaw. No, it just smashed into an iceberg.
Yeah. And I believe what I read was...
Overconfident?
Well, yeah, they definitely were overconfident. There
weren't enough John will go right through that iceberg.
There weren't enough lifeboats on board, which was also in the book. That is
interesting.
It is.
It's like they read the book and they're like, hey, let's go build a ship.
And smash it the same way.
That bitch right into an iceberg, man.
Yeah, it's like the book was the map. It's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, we're laughing about it, but it's actually pretty freaky and interesting and eerie.
Yeah. But the 2% who cancel at the last minute, man, that's the one that gets to me.
Yeah.
Because I found those numbers completely independently.
Yeah.
When we were talking about it, you're the one who said that's about 2%. And then I'm like, wait a minute, 2%? And I had to look through the other research I had done and found where Mario Varvoglis had said that all the meta-analysis came out to 2% of the general population.
And they were right next to each other on the notes.
Right next to each other.
Now, that is interesting. Yeah.
Maybe I got some psi I didn't know about.
Whoa. I remember you saw it and it clicked in your head.
It did, yeah. So that was a very interesting light bulb, eye-opening kind of moment. Now, the skeptics have stuff to say about this, too. I'd just like to remind the skeptics who are watching, we haven't forgotten about you. We're going to get to what you have
We're going to get you. Get to you.
We're definitely going to get to the arguments against. But this is probably the biggest line of evidence that I've seen parapsychologists point to for proof that precognition is a thing, like it's a real thing.
And I will tell you the truth. I do kind of lean a little towards it.
Yeah.
Even as someone somewhat skeptical, not as skeptical as you, but I kind of lean towards that one.
But you've had people friends of yours, tell you stories, and that's actually a good introduction. Why don't you introduce the story that you were told? Because this is fascinating. Yeah,
it actually is interesting. So, I'm friends with an actor, really cool actor from the 90s. You guys will definitely know him from the 90s, but he still does work even now, has a lot of projects. Renely Santiago. He's been in Hackers, Con Air, and Dangerous Minds. He gave me permission to share an interesting experience about precognition regarding 9/11. So, yeah.
All right, well, let's play that segment, and then we'll talk about it.
In Renely's note, The Dreamer, he says, I had a dream that morning that I was there on the rooftop as the planes came toward the building. I remember knowing that they were going to hit and waking abruptly at 8:47 a.m. Later learning that was the time of impact. My phone rang at about 9:20 a.m. and I got the news from my mom. All I could think was, how could I have dreamt this and what did it mean? searching so long for a meaning since I couldn't have possibly done anything at that moment, and I felt my dream was for a reason. It's not easy to discuss. I realize after all these years that it showed me sometimes in life your mind can tune into things and that dreams can be powerful. The mind and heart go beyond the flesh. Even after that experience, it's difficult for me at times to embrace and remember that. I figure it happened for me to share that dreams can be very meaningful.
So your friend Renly
Yeah.
has a dream
Yeah.
that the towers are going to fall
Yeah.
on 9/11, and they do.
Yeah.
That's really, I mean, I don't know what else to say about that. I mean, how is that possible? Tell me some more about that, because it seems, being a skeptic, I'm inclined to be like, well, how does he know it was the Twin Towers? I mean, he gave you some more detail about that, right?
Yeah, no, he did. We were talking on the phone about it.
Oh, wait, just to be clear, he was living in New York at the time, right?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, no, we were talking on the phone about it, and, that note is very interesting, but there was a particular aspect about it that, he never really paid attention to, that when he told me, I said, whoa. I said, Renly, that could be one of the biggest aspects of the story or of the dream that you had right there. So, and it's going to sound a little bit silly, but I'm going to explain to you why I think it's interesting. Or I wouldn't say silly, but it's going to sound far-fetched. But I don't think it's far-fetched. I think it's interesting. But, somebody on the outside might hear and go, wow, okay, that's kind of out there, but I'm going to tie it all in, or try to. So he told me that at the beginning of this dream that he's having, he's inside the restaurant inside the World Trade Center.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
that's how he knows it's the World Trade Center. Okay, all right.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
right. So he's inside, and he says, for some reason, I'm in there, and everybody is just, everything's going well and everything's fine. And he says, Rosie Perez is in there.
Rosie
The actor,
Perez.
yeah. Actor, living color,
Right, sure.
dance coordinator. Rosie Perez is in there.
Hallmark of New York.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he says, after I see Rosie Perez, he's like, suddenly I'm on top of the towers as they come, coming down.
Wow.
And I told him that, to me, that was still, an amazing part of this precognition, because, anybody who knows New York, and knows New York before 2001, before 9/11, would see Rosie Perez as, in essence, the spirit of New York.
Yeah, she's kind of symbolic of that time period.
Right.
Yeah.
She is. She definitely is. And when those towers went down, it's like a part of New York died. And she, in this dream that he had, was a symbol of that. It was a symbol of that old part of New York, or that aspect, that spirit of New York dying. And I thought that was amazing. And I told him, I said, I think that's one of the most amazing aspects of that dream.
Yeah,
I just always thought that was interesting.
That is interesting. And again, that's pretty specific. If he was in the restaurant that's in...
Yeah, because we were talking about it, just going back and forth. And he's like, well, why do you think that's significant? I said, well, think about it. I said, Rosie Perez is, a New Yorker, but she's not just any New Yorker. She's a New Yorker that, through her personality and her style, her attitude, and the ways that she is, represents New York as a persona, and kind of is part of that persona of New York, or that spirit of New York before 9/11, before things changed. Because anybody that lived before 9/11, I was 18 when it happened, knows that, New York was seen differently then. And, even the country in general was different then. Things were different.
Yeah, it did. It had a big impact.
Yeah.
For sure.
And it could be that maybe in that precognition, he saw New York symbolically die or transform in a way.
Gotcha.
So, thought that was interesting.
Now, there was a project, I don't remember the name of it offhand, but I'll show it on the screen. I'll look it up, that placed a bunch of random number generators all over the world. And they claim that when there's major psychic events, that the random numbers start to behave not so randomly. And which should be impossible, but the thinking was that if consciousness wasn't just a intangible thing, but had a real impact on the physical world, hello placebo effect, that it might alter the generation of the numbers in a way that could be measured. And they claimed at the time that the data from New York, where one of these generators was, skewed right before 9/11.
Really?
Right before the impact. And the thinking from like parapsychologists is if even just a small percentage of people have some psi ability, it would have been on high alert at that moment, just like with the Titanic and all the people who canceled. And that presence of psi is what altered the random number generators.
Wow.
Now, the skeptics say, and other analysts have come in and said, it's just imperfect random number generation. The computers aren't great at generating random numbers, and you're just seeing what you want to see. But other people say that it shows some kind of evidence for, and your friend being, Renly being one of these people who had what many would call a premonition about the collapse of the towers. It is interesting. I'll stop there because I'm skeptical about that sort of thing, but it's definitely interesting that he should dream about that the night before that very specific thing happens.
It could be that maybe it's an energy that we have not been able to find ways to scientifically observe yet. I don't know. Maybe it's developing. Maybe it's evolving. Who knows?
Well, we'll definitely get into all the things the skeptics say about it at the end after we discuss all the lines of evidence the parapsychologists use. But there is one more thing I want to say. Mario Varvoglis, who did the meta-analysis of those 50 different studies and found 2% of people in the general population had some form of psychic ability. He also said in that same video that if you split out the people who were selected as having psi-friendly traits, and there's a bunch of things like they had psychic episodes, that they practiced meditation. There's a bunch of different things that parapsychologists believe kind of make someone more likely to have psychic ability. He says if you take the studies out that were just for the general population where they don't choose anybody based on anything, it's like, hey, you want to be in a study? Sure. And they just throw them in there. And you separate those studies from the studies where people were chosen for having these attributes. The people who are just general population actually have less than 1% have a statistical significant psychic ability. But the people who are picked have greater than 5%. Which, if that's true, that again makes me as a skeptic ask the question, what is it that's causing the people with these picked traits to do better on these so-called psychic tests than the average Joe or Jane? Because if it's purely random chance, it shouldn't matter what your attributes are. It shouldn't matter if you practice meditation. None of that should matter at all. You shouldn't be able to pick the porn more often than anybody else. It should still be random.
Yes, you should, John.
But the parapsychologists say, but this is evidence that it's not just random, that it may not be a huge, overwhelming number like 95%, but that 5% is big. And Mario Varvoglis, such a name.
Yeah.
He actually pointed out that there was a meta-analysis done on the study of aspirin and how it affects heart patients. That once a 3.5% effect size is what they call it, the number of people that were affected, was discovered. Like 3.5% of people who take aspirin, it either delays or prevents heart disease, which is not the majority at all. It's a very small percentage. As soon as they discovered in this study that 3.5% of people were affected by taking the aspirin on their heart disease, they canceled the study and said it would be morally wrong not to prescribe all heart patients aspirin, just in case they're one of the 3.5%, because the aspirin's not going to hurt you if you're not in the 3.5%, but if you are, it might save your life, right?
Yeah.
And Mario said, look, 3.5%, they canceled the study, said it'd be morally wrong not to prescribe aspirin.
That was all they needed.
But parapsychologists are showing 5%, and the skeptics dismiss it like, nah, that's nothing. So I found that an interesting argument that he made in regards to psychic ability.
Yeah, especially since we're talking about the placebo effect. So, yeah.
All right. Well, let's get into the next line of evidence then, the Stargate Project.
Yeah. The Stargate Project was the 1991 code name for a secret U.S. Army unit established in 1978 at Fort Meade, Maryland, by the Defense Intelligence Agency and SRI International, a California contractor. It was tasked to investigate the potential for psychic phenomena in military and domestic intelligence applications. Stargate Project work primarily involved remote viewing, the purported ability to psychically see events, sights, or information from a great distance. The project was eventually transferred to the CIA and reviewed by 2 psychologists, one of whom concluded that no one who has examined all the data across laboratories, taken as a collective whole, has been able to suggest methodological or statistical problems to explain the ever-increasing and consistent results to date. There can only be one Ra. Yanks it right off of him.
Oh.
God. The movie was so much cooler than the actual. I remember you showed me, I'm like, ooh, Stargate Project. And you were like, well, actually, Diaz is, no.
It's not that. Though, interestingly, it was declassified in 95. And the Stargate movie, didn't that come out late 94?
It was like 94, 95.
Yeah,
somewhere around there.
The timing is very interesting. But no, I agree with you.
Man.
If they were doing in the Stargate Project run by the CIA or the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and transferred to the CIA, they were doing the same thing they were doing in the movie.
See, if they would have did, if they would have did that. I mean,
the part when he like puts his face in the water and it sucks him through the void. Yeah, that's I love it. That would be cool. But this is still pretty cool.
Raw and Spader.
James
made
Spader,
the movie.
Genius. Everything James Spader does is gold.
See,
Everything.
if he would have walked in like he does on The Blacklist, the movie would have been 2 minutes long. Yeah, Ra, I'm going to need you to go ahead and do this. Donuts are delicious, by the way. Walks out. He's like, oh, you guys got 2 minutes.
Yeah, my favorite part is when he walks into the UN because there's been a bomb scare or whatever, and they're playing Soul Coughing, Step Aside and Let the Man Go Through. Spader all the way.
There's only one Spader.
Love you, Spader. You're awesome.
We hope you're watching.
Yeah.
He's not watching.
That would be... He's not watching. One day.
One day.
He will be watching. All right. So they got these people who are purported to be psychics because, this is the military we're talking about. And they're like, shoot, if they can actually see targets that nobody's ever been to from way far away. And this is long before drones were a thing, because this is 1978 to 1995 when they canceled and declassified it.
Yeah.
In 1978, you didn't have a drone. I bought a birthday present for an 8-year-old drone for $30 from Target last week. I mean, you can get a drone anywhere today, but they didn't have
when we
that.
were kids, we could not get that. How come we couldn't get that when we were kids, John?
The best we had was that cheap-ass plane
the helicopter
with the string attached, and it could go like 3 feet and it'd break after 20 minutes. Yeah, it was not the same. But these guys...
Flying up into the ceiling fan. Yeah!
The military figured if there's any chance that this is true,
right,
and that these people could see these things from far away. Well, they had to test it out.
Look, John, they need some freedom.
Now, what I found fascinating is that there weren't a lot of pictures that I could find from the Stargate project that were very impressive. But there is one in particular, and circle back to Mario, Mr. Mario, because he discussed this in that same video when he's talking about psychic ability and the meta-analysis. He shows the picture of the target that the remote viewer was supposed to see.
That was really interesting.
And the picture that they drew, which is very similar.
I wonder about that. I really wonder about that one. Because that one,
Now, this is one of those situations because, and I'll say this up front, it's not really up front anymore. We're halfway into this. That there's bias on both sides.
Right.
I think I see a lot of bias from the parapsychologists because they already believe, and I see a lot of bias from the skeptics because they don't believe. It's like that the researcher Maria from Belgrade said that I'm terrible with those last names, so I'm just using first names. But it's about
like 30 letters long. So.
Yeah, it's about how you think. Right. And so if your worldview is already very data-driven, rationally driven facts and evidence, you're going to dismiss anything that doesn't fit into your worldview just because it doesn't fit in your worldview, or you're just going to view it through the lens of your worldview. To someone who's colorblind and can only see black and white, even though nobody's really that colorblind, there is no color. So it's all shades of gray because that's how they see. But to someone who can see in full color, it's an entirely different picture, but you're looking at the same thing. So sometimes it's not that the facts aren't there. It's how are they being interpreted. So the skeptics dismissed that image that came out of the Stargate project.
It did look a little too close. It was eerie.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, either somebody tipped somebody off or psychic ability is for real, flat out, straight up.
Right.
I mean, that one was too close to be in the middle. That was either totally fake or totally real.
Yeah. And it's interesting you should put it that way because when they finally did shut down the project, CIA said, okay, we're done with this. They had 2 psychologists review the work. One was like we showed in the segment, we read in the segment, it's like, you got to see, there's something here. And the other one was like, nah, there's nothing.
Yeah.
So that kind of shows you what those two people's worldview was. And we'll get into what the skeptics say in addition to those 2 psychologists in the last part of the video. But it's that pictures, that's a hell of a thing.
If it's real, that's incredible.
Yeah, definitely incredible.
If it's real.
But at this point, before we get into the next line of evidence, I want to just talk just for a second about this. It's what's called the sheep-goat effect, because worldview ties into this directly. It has been shown, according to parapsychologists, that people who believe they have the ability perform better on tests that test for the ability than people who don't believe. If you do believe, you're called a sheep. If you don't believe, you're skeptical, you're called a goat.
Well, and honestly, for people out here who are watching who are very spiritual, they would say that's the law of attraction.
Right.
They would say it's like that movie, The Secret. You're not manifesting positive energy that would allow, the good things or the things that you want to come to you.
Yeah. That's what they would say.
That's what they would say.
And the parapsychologists say that you've seen the Zener cards in Ghostbusters, right? Right, when he's testing them because he
Venkman. He was the best.
Venkman. Again, Bill Murray, genius up there with James Spader. Awesome people.
Love that movie.
But the parapsychologists say that the people who believe they can perform better on those tests actually do. If they believe they have some kind of psychic ability. And if random chance is all that was involved, what you believe should have no effect at all. Right. And like I said, I could believe the table is going to lift up into the sky, but that's not going to raise it off the floor at all. John. Well, and again, that goes back to that's a good point. Back to the
It's
placebo
making
effect.
them more psychic.
And does the mind have impact on the physical world? The placebo effect shows that it absolutely does have an impact on your body.
Right.
But can it reach outside of the body? Now, the believers would say yes. The parapsychologists would say there's something else going on. And the skeptics would say no, we're dealing with apples and oranges. Your mind's ability to trigger endorphins or something isn't the same as reading cards from someone else's mind. So it is interesting, though.
Yeah, no, it is.
All right, now, the last line of evidence isn't really a line of evidence at all. It's an explanation that parapsychologists give for why independent studies done by skeptics almost never can duplicate the results that the parapsychologists get. So let's roll that and then we'll talk about it. Parapsychology refers to what they call the psi experimenter effect, which an article in the 1976 Journal of Parapsychology defines as unintentional psi, which affects an experimental outcome in ways that are directly related to the experimenter's needs, wishes, expectancies, moods, etc. An article on parapsych.org explained further that experimenters may use slightly different instructions, different vocal intonations, gestures, and other forms of nonverbal communication, and that these messages could influence participants in the study. For instance, some parapsychologists have conducted psychopsychological studies in which participants seem to be psychically able to detect an unseen gaze. In 1995 and 1998, Professor Richard Wiseman of the University of Hertfordshire in the United Kingdom carried out joint studies in collaboration with Dr. Marilyn Schlitz of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Dr. Schlitz is a parapsychologist who carried out many of the most successful staring studies, and Dr. Wiseman is a skeptic. The joint studies revealed evidence of an experimenter effect, with the sessions carried out by Professor Wiseman, the skeptic, obtaining quite different results from those conducted by Dr. Schlitz, the believer. However, a third joint study, reported in 2005, failed to replicate this experimenter effect. The results so impressed Dr. Wiseman that he stated that although he does not think the results of laboratory-based studies into psychic ability provide convincing evidence of such abilities, he does believe that they justify further work in this area. Now, when I first saw this part about this psi experimenter effect, when I did this research, I immediately thought, cop out, because it didn't work for you because you don't believe. That, to me, that wasn't evidence. Being a skeptic, I'm like, look, it shouldn't matter. Again, back to the table off the floor. It shouldn't matter whether or not the person doing the study believes. The skeptic should be able to come behind them, do the same study, the same test, the same methodology, and it should work in the same way. But
Unless the universe is as intelligent as some people who are spiritual say it is, the ones of the pantheistic nature, and that maybe it chooses who it wants to reveal itself to or manifest itself to.
Right.
We even see this in religion down through the ages. You got to have hope. You got to have faith. You got to believe it. And to those, the Holy Spirit, Holy Ghost, or God, Jesus, whatever you want to call him, or whatever religion we're talking about, Allah, Muhammad reveals himself to.
Right. Yeah, well, I'm not religious now, but I was raised, we talked about a strict Christian religion. So I remember a lot of stuff about Jesus. And I do remember that part in the gospel where he was telling the apostles, they were like, well, why couldn't we exorcise the demon? He's like, because you didn't have enough faith. So I get what
believe.
Yeah, it wasn't that there was something wrong with the person who was possessed or whatever. It was that the person doing the work didn't have enough faith. So that's kind of what the parapsychologists are saying, that on the extreme end, that you actually bring psychic energy into the situation, and because your energy is skeptical, it kills the buzz, if you will, the
Killed
psychic
the
buzz
vibe,
in the
man.
room. No, but again, when I first read that, I thought that was a cop-out, though I did that one article on Parapsych.org, they were more balanced about it. They're like, look, a different instructor, different presenter, researcher is going to use different instructions, different vocal intonations, gestures, other forms of non-verbal communication, and these messages
Scare them away.
could influence the study. Now, it's not necessarily that they're trying to sabotage
Right.
anything.
No,
it's that
they just don't believe.
And your worldview is going to dictate how you speak, how you present things. It's hard
Sure.
to mask your disbelief in these things.
Sure, you won't be really desirous of it, and you won't really be convinced of it in any way at all.
Yeah.
So
Now, I didn't find, I'm like, okay, I'll give you that, but I didn't find it convincing. And I'm still not convinced, but they won me over a lot farther towards the middle when I read about Professor Richard Wiseman, who did that study, the joint study with Dr. Marilyn Schlitz. Now, Schlitz is a believer and Wiseman is a skeptic. He's in some he's a, what do they call it? I got his thing here. He's a fellow for the Committee of Skeptical Inquiry and a patron of Humanists UK. Oh, wow. He's not a believer. And he's no joke. He's giving keynote addresses to the Royal Society, Swiss Economic Forum, Google, Amazon. And the guy's legit. Well, he does this joint study with Schlitz, who's the believer, where they're trying to detect an unseen gaze. So someone's looking at somebody through a video camera. And the person who's got the video camera on them has to try to determine whether or not somebody's looking at them. Supposedly,
watching us now.
Yeah. We're watching you. But supposedly there's some kind of psychic energy, if you're a believer, that you can tell someone's watching you even though you can't see them watching you. You know, eyes in the back of your head kind of a thing. Well, they did this joint study together. Professor Wiseman, the skeptic, and Dr. Schlitz, the believer, the parapsychologist, in the same room, same setup, same equipment, same people, same everything, same methodology. When Wiseman did it, didn't get any positive results. When Schlitz did it, got positive results. 2 out of the 3 times they did the joint studies, and parapsychologists say, see, that's what we're talking about. It's not enough just to use the same equipment, same methodology, same everything. The people performing it have an impact.
The universe knows.
That's what the believer would say. Well, of course it didn't work for them. They're not a sheep. Sheep-goat effect, right? I think Jesus says something about being a sheep too.
There you go.
There we go. Listen to Jesus.
Too many parallels.
Too many parallels. So it is very interesting that it worked out that way, so much to the point that I got to give Wiseman snaps here, even though he's skeptical, because I'm skeptical too. He's open-minded. He said on his site that although he does not think the results of laboratory-based studies into psychic ability provide convincing evidence of such abilities, he does believe that they do justify further work in this area. You know what?
It's a fair statement.
That sums up how I feel. I don't believe there's convincing evidence of anything.
You want to see more.
But I do think there's enough funny business going on that it warrants people looking into it and researching it and studying it to try to figure out what's going on.
So you're not saying there's definitely a ghost down the hallway, but you're saying maybe we should go down there and look a little bit more.
Yeah. That's
shine a few more lights down there, see what's going on.
That's what I think. I think it's worth looking into what's going on because I feel like knowledge and study and science and research, it's important. Why does the placebo effect work? Yeah. Why should your mind have such an impact on your body? Because shoot, we could use that. I mean, if we understand why and how to trigger that, you could trigger someone to get better as if they'd taken medicine without ever having to give the medicine that's got side effects.
Yeah.
Right? There's a practical, logical, rational reason to want to know how and why that stuff works.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can even understand a little bit of the skeptic's point of view here. They watch these countless ghost stories, hear these countless tales. They haven't seen anything themselves. And they're like, okay, if you're not going to, what do they put up or shut up at this point? Show me something tangible.
Yeah.
And they keep coming back with mysterious or vague test results. They keep hearing about these experiences or even watching ghost stories. And then by the end of it, still nothing documented, no hard evidence, nothing observable or consistent.
Yeah. They would say,
like, to hell with it.
But I get it. Devil's advocate on the parapsychology side. How do you create a study where you sink the Titanic? How do you do that?
Yeah.
How do you duplicate something that massive that the parapsychologist would say generates these huge psychic phenomena? How do you recreate that in a lab? You can't kill 2,435 people just to test your theory,
Unless you're a sick bastard.
I mean, you can't do that. So how do you reproduce the big, large-scale stuff that parapsychologists say are evidence? I mean, I get it. It's tough.
It's true.
But, I'm glad you brought up ghosts. Because, man, when you and Mike...
Oh, God.
We're going to do an episode on ghosts. You do not
we have
want
to show the clip?
Oh, we have got to show the clip.
No.
Because Diasis and his roommate, Mike, they go to this haunted house. And it is...
What the hell?
Whether you believe or not, man, this shit is gold. You have got to watch it. So don't miss that episode when it drops. All right. But that's a good segue into all the skeptical stuff. Skeptics, you suffered through all the stuff that you don't believe. Now let's talk about the reasons skeptics give for why all of this is baloney. And you shouldn't believe it. And if anybody's on the fence, you can decide between the two sides. You want to go over that first reason against there?
All right. So, against. The $1 million paranormal challenge was an offer of $1 million to anyone who can demonstrate a paranormal ability under scientific testing conditions. From 1964 to 2015, when the competition was terminated, not a single person of over 1,000 applicants succeeded in proving their supernatural ability. It didn't want to present itself, John.
I get that that's what the believer would say.
It didn't want to be there.
But if you're going to convince the skeptic...
It doesn't do it for money.
I mean, come on.
Isn't that noble?
If you're going to convince the skeptic, you got to come into the arena, you got to come into the lab, you got to prove that you can read the minds or pick the cards or whatever. You have to prove that you can do this under laboratory tested, repeatable conditions. $1 million is a big incentive. Over 1,000 people applied and nobody could do it. Nobody.
The energy doesn't want to be seen right now. Maybe it's an introvert, John.
But shouldn't the psychics have known that and not shown up to begin with? I mean, come on now. Let's get the skeptics some credit here.
all right. Okay.
Yeah, and you probably noticed we're not doing segments on these because these are just the counter arguments against what all those proofs that we did the segments for are.
Because they don't deserve segments.
Yeah, so that all right, Diaz, let's be fair. All right, I put up with your BS, so let's put up with some of mine. Okay, so now the next is the Gansfeld experiment, which we were both kind of iffy about anyway. Yeah. And what the researchers say about that...
I'm not fully for that one either, to be fair.
Yeah, and the skeptics say, look, we looked over this stuff. We looked over these studies. Like, there's all kinds of problems with them. Tests are flawed.
The ping pong balls on that.
The ping...
that right there.
That's the best you could do is the ping pong balls. I mean, come on. So tests are flawed.
Worst sci-fi I've ever seen.
Poor results are ignored. They're generally inconsistent. There's problems with sensory leaks. Yeah. You really think the ping pong balls are going to keep them from seeing anything? Okay, you're wearing headphones, but is the room completely soundproof? No. So how do you... There's problems. There's problems with these things. And then the last point they make is even if you get a statistically significant hit rate, that doesn't necessarily indicate the presence of psi. And that's one of the problems that skeptics have with parapsychology. True. They say, look, just because you found something doesn't mean it's what you say it is. You haven't proven it's what you say it is. You've only proven that something is going on. And maybe that something is your test sucks. And you're doing this poorly. So that's their arguments against the Ganzfeld experiment. So I'm getting more animated because I'm more skeptical. And so I tend to agree with this stuff more than the other. Though I'll be fair, some of that stuff is pretty wild and crazy. I agree, especially the Titanic thing.
The Titanic one is,
yeah, that's pretty big. All right, what's the next argument against?
Arguments against Professor Daryl Bem's Feeling the Future. None of the independent groups that replicated the experiment could replicate the results. The same journal, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, in 2012 published Correcting the Past Failures to Replicate Psi, which reported on 7 experiments testing for precognition that found no evidence supporting its existence.
Yes, okay, no one's disputing Professor Bem's highly credentialed background or the fact that he got this paper into this famed journal of personality and social psychology. But nobody else who's repeated the tests have been able to get the same results, which the parapsychologist would say is the psi experimenter effect. But the skeptic would say, well, that's just baloney. That's just a cop-out. And then the same journal retracted it basically and said, we're wrong. We shouldn't publish that garbage. I'm seriously misquoting here.
I mean, that is pretty bad.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. No evidence. So that's you'll
it
never
is interesting
convince,
that they couldn't replicate the results.
Yeah,
that's true.
You'll never convince a skeptic.
That's true.
Of the psi experimenter effect,
or the materialist or more secular minded. I mean, that's true. To be fair, they're not going to believe something. Yeah. Well, that materially, from a material point of view, has no basis, right? To be believed in.
And that's kind of the biggest problem we run into here is that the skeptics are always materialists. The world, the universe is what it is, and that's all it is. It's movement and the change of energy and matter and forces that we can measure and we can see and we can control and all that. Whereas the believer says, no, that's not all the picture. That's a lot of the picture, but that's not all the picture. And so they will never see eye to eye on some of these things. No. Yeah, but that's their argument.
Very opposed worldviews here.
Yeah. Now, as for the Titanic thing, as cool as that was, like the guy who wrote the book, Morgan Robertson, he disavowed having any psychic ability. He said, look, I didn't have a premonition. I know boats. I think he was some kind of engineer. Like, I know boats. I know that part of the ocean. I know how this stuff works. And that was likely to happen based on the way they would build and construct these ships and everything.
Okay. But a lot of people who have premonitions, supposedly, and precognition, they don't claim to be psychics either.
That's your friend.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Your friend.
He's no psychic.
Yeah, that's the other side of that coin is, well, just because you don't believe you are doesn't mean you are. You're not. I mean, it doesn't mean you're not. It just means you don't know it. So, okay, I get that. But, I mean, he doesn't claim to have any psychic. And that's really specific. I mean, if he doesn't know or believe he's a psychic but can do all that, oh, come on. Surely he would have had something in his life that convinced him he had some kind of ability. I mean, why would the universe grant the skeptic who denies any ability?
Because it wanted him to believe.
Yeah, see, now you're switching your theories.
It wanted him to believe.
Right.
It's going to make a believer out of him. Try to give him a chance, and he blew it. He blew it.
Well, and then you've got the 2,500-ish people on board. And like I said earlier, the probability that some of them were going to be spooked about it is just high. The 50% who canceled
it was a new boat,
the last second.
Maiden voyage. Yeah. It's not tried, tested, and true yet.
And then you've got the problem with any time you deal with history, anytime you're dealing with history, all we know is what was written down, what was saved. It's not like they had video recording of everyone didn't have a cell phone with a camera on it back then where all this stuff was being broadcast around the world all over the internet. And stuff gets cloudy. So when you get, 50 people canceled at the last minute, what are the records? How do you prove it? What's something else going on? We just don't have enough information. And from the skeptic worldview, it's like there's going to be another explanation if we had all the details, but we just don't have it. And because we don't have it is not a good enough reason to say it must be psychic.
Yeah.
That's what the skeptic would say.
Yeah, that's true. That's what they say.
It's a worldview conflict.
Same thing about, and the skeptics say the same thing about religion too. They say, well, just because you can't explain it doesn't mean God.
Right. Yeah, until you have evidence of God.
Religious people's explanation for everything. Oh, well, we can't, well, God.
Yeah, we're not keeping him in the equation until you have some data that there's some old dude with a beard out there blessing people or whatever. We're not going to pay any attention to that. So I get the perspective. I do. And for the most part, I agree with it. I'm not all the way on that side, but I'm definitely farther over there.
You kind of lean.
Than you. I lean that way heavily. All right. Now we've got those so-called psi experiments and all the evidence they showed, and the 2%, while we're talking about the Titanic, 2% of the general population having some kind of psychic ability or whatever. 3 psychologists, Rawcliffe, Hansel, and Hyman, 4, and Neher, all these weird last names. They studied all the psi experiments documented from the late 19th century up to the 1980s. Every single experiment they investigated, they found flaws and weaknesses that led to the possibility of sensory leakage, and that trickery could not be ruled out.
Possibly. Maybe. Sure.
They say that they're not very well done. They're not very well executed. There's too much room for sensory leakage and problems, and that until you have I
don't want them to be well done.
You need a better study. That's what they're saying, And I'm kind of there with them on that. I'm like, look, if you need your study to not be very well constructed to get the results that you want to find, I mean, that
make it as shitty as possible. All right, team? We need to fail some people today.
Yeah. Now, the parapsychologists would say that the equipment and the testing and all that is getting better and all that. But even so, what's the next one there? That one. I want you to read that one, Mr. Believer.
All right, man. Listen. Failure to produce a single phenomenon that can be independently replicated by neutral researchers and the invention of effects such as psi experimenter effect to explain away inconsistencies in the data and failures to achieve predicted outcomes. Not one.
I mean, come on. If someone could really read somebody else's mind, surely we'd have all kinds of evidence of this sort of thing. If you could really see stuff from hundreds of miles away, if you've never been there, I mean, surely we could document this stuff easily beyond the shadow of a doubt.
People have dreams all the time, John.
Nobody doubts gravity, right? If I drop the cup, it's going to fall. We can easily show that to people. Why can't we easily show these so-called psychic abilities? Why is it always in the haze and fuzziness of numbers and statistics that maybe sort of kind of there's this small statistical
into the unknown in the gray.
This little statistically significant blip that proves we must have psychic ability. I mean, why isn't it just more obvious? I know.
This is garbage.
I know your side of that is that. How do you word it? That there's too many coincidences?
I think my personal belief is that with some of this, there are too many coincidences, too many similarities, too many similar stories to just rule it all out.
Gotcha.
That's where I'm at.
I don't know. That's what the parapsychologists say too. Now, the next point is that just the very idea of psychic ability violates well-established laws of physics. And I have a bunch of uninteresting laws written out, so it's not important. But the idea is that we should be able to measure it. Like if you can read somebody's mind, or if you can raise something off a table or something, there's energy involved. causing that to happen. And we should be able to measure that energy. But if that was possible, it violates all these well-established, tested
Well, you see, John,
laws.
it's unknown energy. It's positive energy.
Yeah. Well, I guess the flip side of that is like what astronomers talk about, dark energy.
There it is.
Like they believe it's there, but they don't know what it is, or they haven't been able to measure it, but it must be there because the math shows it there.
Oh, dark
It's
matter.
there.
Dark matter?
Dark energy and dark
Same
matter. It's
thing.
two different things.
It's all the same.
But then that gets, I want you to read the next one too. The Felix planar, that electrical engineering.
All right.
Yeah, not the whole thing, just that first part, first sentence or two there.
All right. Felix Planner, a professional of electrical engineering, has written that if psychokinesis was real, then it would be easy to demonstrate by getting subjects to depress a scale on a sensitive balance, raise the temperature of a water bath, which could be measured with an accuracy of 1/100th of a degree Celsius, or affect an element in an electrical circuit, such as a resistor, which could be monitored to better than a millionth of an ampere.
Yeah, I think it's ampere. It's an electrical thing.
Ampere.
Yeah, like we call it.
It's like the fancy way of saying it.
We just say amps, and that's really all I need you to read. I mean, the point is, come on, if you can use your mind to bend a spoon through heat or whatever.
They can in The Matrix.
I mean, I love The Matrix. Don't get me wrong. It's a kick-ass movie.
Another good movie.
It still holds up. 20 years later, I watched it a few weeks ago. It's still amazing.
It is. It is.
The lobby scene where there's so much gunfire, like the whole building's collapsing. It's amazing. But,
I like Agent Smith.
But that's a movie. If these guys really exist and they could raise the temperature of the water by 1/100th of a degree, it could be tracked. If they really had telekinesis and could push a scale down a tiny, tiny little bit, it could be measured. Planar
I am
says,
somewhat of a skeptic of the telekinesis thing.
Yeah. That last part there, planar is written. Parapsychologists have to fall back on studies that involve only statistics that are unrepeatable, owing their poor results to experimental methods, recording mistakes, and faulty statistical mathematics. They're fudging the numbers. That's what the psychic would say.
He did make an interesting point here. He said, parapsychologists don't hold out the remotest hope of demonstrating even a minute trace of any of that.
Yeah.
What is it? Psychokinesis.
Yeah, psychokinesis. Yeah.
I'm a skeptic of the psychokinesis too. That one, yeah.
But you know what I have to say about that?
What?
Placebo effect.
Believe it.
The mind affects the body in a very real way, so why is it impossible for it to affect something outside?
I don't know.
That is kind of a leap.
Energy.
That is kind of a leap. I don't know.
I mean, how many watts does our brain run off of? It's not a lot of energy.
The brain is actually amazingly efficient. There's a supercomputer in China.
It's LED, man.
Finally a supercomputer built that can surpass the human brain's ability in terms of transactions per second. It's measured in teraflops per second.
What the hell was that?
Trillions of calculations.
What the hell is a teraflop?
Teraflop. Not like flop, but trillions of calculations per second. That's how fast your brain is. Trillions of calculations per second.
Wow.
And a computer is finally built that's faster than the human brain. However, it is the size of a massive warehouse. Imagine a Walmart full of computer.
Damn.
Requires the energy consumption of a small city.
Wow.
Meanwhile, you shove a cheeseburger and a banana in your body and your brain functions more or less efficiently for half the day. So when you talk about efficiency, your brain is ultra efficient in comparison to computers, which have enormous heat loss and require massive amounts of space. But it is pretty damn impressive that it can do more calculations per second than your brain.
Yeah, wow, that's pretty interesting. Didn't know that.
Yep. So there's a little sidebar for you. And
supplemental.
Yeah, supplemental. And philosopher and physicist Mario Bunge has written that psychokinesis, or PK, violates the principle that mind cannot act directly on matter. But placebo effect. I always go back to that one. I really think the placebo effect is probably the strongest argument that there's something going on. I'm not going to call it psychic ability, but that there's a connection mind to at least body, if not out there, definitely in here.
I believe that one.
And so I think that
I just want to know how.
Yeah, I think it warrants research.
It is fair from a scientific perspective. How?
Yeah.
What's the mechanism?
Because, man, if you could just activate that,
like
we'll just turn on the placebo effect. That way he doesn't have to take any medicine. You click. That would be amazing. It's worth looking into.
Yeah.
And then the last one is the Stargate Project, where you've got the one psychologist who was like, wow, this is so awesome. It proves everything. And the other one's like, nah, it's all BS. And then they brought in another team to study at the American Institutes for Research. And they reviewed the results and said that these alleged psychic techniques were of dubious value. They lacked the concreteness and reliability necessary for it to be used to make decisions or take actions. And the final report found reason to suspect that in some well-publicized cases, like that one that was like really awesome looking, of dramatic hits, the remote viewers might have had substantially more background information than might otherwise be apparent. Leakage, right? Leakage. Yeah. That's what they say. So, having gone through all this, has it pushed you any further either direction?
No, I mean, I would say I'm still somewhere in the middle with a slight spiritual wonder, is that for real type of lean. Yeah.
I have to admit, before I did this, I was more hardcore on the skeptical side.
Yeah.
Now, to be clear, I don't believe. I'm not a believer at all. But I think that there's enough things that have happened, like Professor Wiseman said, Richard Wiseman, who's also a skeptic but did the joint studies with Dr. Schlitz, that there's enough going on that warrants, warrants people looking into it. At least look into research.
So you want more investigative research done?
Yeah, I don't believe it's psychic, but I want to know what it is,
right?
Because I feel like it could be useful.
Yeah,
we could do something with it.
It would be awesome if it is real, if we could somehow tap into that type of energy.
Yeah. So what's your strongest evidence for, you think?
Well, I would say precognition.
Right.
Precognition to me seems to be the most interesting here because you see a lot of coincidences and similarities between the people who experience it. So, yeah.
Yeah, that Titanic that's pretty interesting stuff going on. It's pretty
stuff
impressive.
Like that. You know, stuff that kind of makes you wonder, okay, something's got to be going on here.
Yeah. Playing devil's advocate, what do you think the strongest evidence against any kind of psychic ability is?
The skeptics not being able to see any of this stuff randomly happen.
Right.
And even if they do, they can never replicate it, duplicate it. They can explain it away.
Yeah.
But, you know, the main thing that I hear from skeptics seems to be the same thing. I've never seen anything. My grandmother said this house was haunted her whole life. I walked in there. I spent the whole week in there. I didn't hear her see anything.
Right.
She said she heard stuff as soon as I walked out of the room. How come I didn't see it? How come I didn't? That is true. That happens a lot. And I see that a lot with skeptics.
Mm-hmm.
So... yeah.
For me, I think the strongest evidence pro is placebo effect. And the strongest evidence against is what Professor Planer was saying. We got all these instruments. We could measure the tiniest fraction of anything anyone could do. And the reason why you don't ever use that equipment is because you need to hide behind the statistics because numbers are easily fudged.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the strongest argument. Why not just get the extremely sensitive scale and have the person you swear has telekinetic ability to push it down, even just a tiny bit, Be a believer. Do it with all believers. Have a seance around a table with a scale in the middle.
Make it happen.
And push it down just that tiny fraction and record it and prove it. And they never do that. Why? Well, because they know it's not going to work.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably the strongest argument against. Well, I feel like that was a pretty good episode.
Yeah.
I'm pretty happy with it.
Definitely.
If you liked it, be sure to click like. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notifications icon so you get notified when we release new videos. You do not want to miss the ghost video.
Yes, you do.
No, you
do.
No, don't miss that one. If you don't watch anything else, watch that one. And as I can't say as always, because this is our first video, but I'm going to say as always anyway, because you're going to keep watching. As always, thanks for watching.
Thank you for tuning into our show.
Now that you've seen the evidence for and against, be sure to leave us a comment and tell us, is that for real?
Perfect.